one mystery card every Christmas.
Oh, I hate not knowing.
Here, there's a tree in the living room by the window. A real Christmas tree.
Here. There was an old man of Peru who dreamt he was eating his shoe. He woke in the night to a terrible fright and found it was perfectly true.
And here.
It was ridiculous for a man of more than 50 to go on being disappointed that there was no snow on Christmas morning.
Over here.
We're dealing with Geoffrey Chaucer here, not Benny Hill.
BBC Radio 4.
What worked for John Wayne was never going to work for me.
Christmas is here.
This is BBC Radio 4. It's 5 o'clock and time for Saturday PM with Caroline Wyatt.
Fighting for a deal on global climate change as talks run over into extra time.
We've been up all night and working on the various texts and finding that balance, which is a challenge.
We'll discuss the sticking points with the former Environment Secretary. Can MPs stop a no-deal Brexit from happening? The Foreign Secretary says perhaps not. Is he right? A year on, 2 Reuters journalists remain in prison in Myanmar.
She says, "Mummy, why doesn't Daddy live with us? Is it because he doesn't love us?" It's painful for me to hear that.
We'll look at racism in football.
There has been a change, but it hasn't necessarily been a change for the better. We haven't seen bananas on pitches, but it doesn't say anything about football's ability to clean up the issue.
Is the media partly to blame? First, the BBC News, read by Neil Sleet.
Delegates at the United Nations climate talks in Poland have been given more time to reach agreement. At issue is how to enforce the promised emissions cuts made under the Paris Accord 3 years ago. A former lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Professor Joanna Hay, said delegates were trying to clarify complex issues.
The remaining main sticking point is how countries measure their CO2 emissions, how they're recorded and how it's done fairly, and how other countries can judge whether or not they're sort of telling the truth. And then around that is the whole issue of who's paying who for what. So the poor countries can receive some funding from the richer countries, which means that the rich countries can then emit more carbon as they're buying the trade off the poorer countries.
President Trump has announced that his Interior Secretary will leave his post at the end of the year. Ryan Zinke has been facing numerous ethics investigations into his business dealings and policy decisions. He's always denied any wrongdoing. In a message posted on Twitter, Mr. Trump thanked Mr. Zinke for the nearly 2 years of service. The Foreign Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, has said he still believes the EU will provide the assurances needed to get Theresa May's Brexit through Parliament. Earlier, the Work and Pensions Secretary Amber Rudd said it was now time to try something different, and she urged MPs to reach a cross-party consensus. Here's our political correspondent Tom Barton.
It might not quite be a cabinet split, but there's certainly a disagreement between senior ministers over the viability of Theresa May's Brexit deal. Amber Rudd openly musing that the government needs to try something different because Parliament is currently heading towards no compromise, no agreement and no deal. While Jeremy Hunt insists it will be possible to get a version of the Prime Minister's Brexit deal approved by MPs as long as the EU thinks again about the Northern Ireland backstop. For now, Parliament's debate on the deal is paused. Ministers appear to be at odds over the terms of that debate when it eventually resumes.
A mother and her 8-year-old daughter have died in a house fire in Nottinghamshire. A 34-year-old man and a young boy were taken to hospital with serious injuries after the blaze at Collingham near Newark. Staff at Chester Zoo say they're working to account for all its species after a fire there earlier today. Visitors were evacuated from the attraction in Cheshire after the blaze at the monsoon forest habitat. One person was treated for the effects of smoke inhalation. The zoo says critically endangered Sumatran orangutans and other mammals are all accounted for. A man has been remanded in custody charged with planning an act of terrorism. Fatah Mohammed Abdullah was arrested on Tuesday in Newcastle. John McManus was at Westminster Magistrates Court.
33-year-old Fatah Mohammed Abdullah appeared at Westminster Magistrates Court to answer a charge of intention to commit acts of terrorism, namely by purchasing a knife, balaclava and explosive precursors, and by searching the internet for guides on how to make explosives and for components such as a pressure cooker and nails. Mr Abdullah, who gave his address as in Newcastle, denies the charge and applied to the court for bail, which was refused. The case has now been sent for trial at the Old Bailey on the 14th of January.
A single leader has been chosen to lead Ukraine's Orthodox churches, making it possible for it to be granted official independence from the Russian Patriarchate. Moscow accused the president, Petro Poroshenko, of engineering what it said was a political move. Kiev has accused churches backed by Moscow of being a tool for spreading propaganda. The authorities in Egypt have unveiled a tomb dating back nearly 4,500 years. The tomb, decorated with hieroglyphs and statues, was found at the ancient necropolis of Saqqara, south of Cairo. Officials say it's well preserved and they hope it will lead to further discoveries.
Neil, thank you. Nobody said that saving the planet would be easy.
Right now, we're facing a man-made disaster of global scale. Our greatest threat in thousands of years, climate change. If we don't take action, the collapse of our civilizations and the extinction of much of the natural world is on the horizon.
A warning from David Attenborough, who was speaking at the start of the UN Climate Change Conference in Poland almost 2 weeks ago. While many here have been focused on the agonies of Brexit negotiations, officials trying to get the world to agree on how to cut greenhouse gas emissions have been having an even tougher time of it. They talked through the night and extended their deadline as they try to finalise a deal. So if they all agree on the threat, why is reaching a consensus on the next steps to limit global warming so tough? Ovais Samad of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change.
We've been up all night and working on the various texts and finding that balance, which is a challenge. The balance between all aspects of the Paris Agreement rule book that satisfies all countries, which is, as you can imagine, a big challenge.
Well, I'm joined now by John Gummer, now Lord Deedham, who was John Major's Environment Secretary. He chairs the Independent Committee on Climate Change, which advises the government here. Thank you for joining us. What are these talks hoping to achieve, and why is it proving so hard to reach that deal?
Well, they have achieved two things, as long as that's carried through at the end of the plenary. One is that they've agreed on a much tougher goal for financing the changes, particularly in poor countries, by 2025. That wasn't expected, and that is a very cheering part. And a rather complex bit they've achieved, which is how you actually count the greenhouse gas emissions. And on that, the developing countries have accepted that they're going to have to measure very accurately so that everybody recognises each other's figures. And that is another breakthrough of considerable importance and shows how complicated this whole matter is. So it's really that we're trying to put really detailed figures on the general agreements that the whole world made so remarkably in Paris.
And one of the trickiest areas seems to be this question of poorer nations receiving support from richer nations for the damage caused by global warming. Is that a debate, do you think, that will continue to dominate this?
Well, yes, because there are two bits to it. One is we've obviously caused most of the problem, and indeed Britain has played a very big part in it because we led the Industrial Revolution. So we're going to have to pay for the changes in developing countries which will enable them to grow without damaging the climate even further. But there's this other bit, which is that some countries are being particularly damaged by climate change, like these little islands in the Pacific, which are actually going to be overwhelmed and are having to buy land elsewhere for their population. And they're asking not just for help in order to change their own systems to fight climate change, but they're asking for compensation. And of course, the richer nations, although they're sympathetic to that, realise that once you started doing that, where would that end? So there is a very complex issue which has to be hammered out and will go on being hammered out.
And what about major developing economies such as India and Brazil? Will they listen to those who are pushing for stronger action? Because it is all very well for already industrialised nations to say to developing countries, you must change tack. But a lot of people will hear that as the West trying to say, do as we say, not as we do.
Well, we might have worried about that before, but if you look at China, for example, it's really leading the world now in the degree to which it is fighting climate change. India has committed itself to very considerable changes. It's a bit difficult to see what's happening in Brazil at the moment because of the change of government, and that's a great sadness. And there are some other countries that really need to pull their socks up. The Australians are particularly bad, and I must say, for most of us, a change of government in Australia so that they begin to play a part in this operation would be a very great help.
And you advise the British government on this. What will we as the UK have to do to help combat global climate change?
Well, we have a good system. We are already committed to cutting our emissions by 80% by the year 2050. The government has now asked us in the Climate Change Committee to advise them how we reach the targets which we agreed to in Paris, and that means reaching towards net zero. And that's what we will be recommending sometime early next year. So altogether, I think Britain is leading, but we're going to have to be very much tougher. And the government is going to have to move faster if it's going to keep on track for meeting our commitments.
Lord Demon, thank you. Another day, another minister on the radio, banging the drum for Theresa May's Brexit deal. Privately, though, cabinet divisions are increasing on what should happen if or when the deal doesn't get through Parliament. Although there does seem to be a majority of MPs who are against a no-deal Brexit, the Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt warned the EU that it can't rely on the House of Commons to avert it.
Although some people in the EU may say that Parliament would stop a no-deal scenario, they can't be sure of that. If they choose not to be helpful and to be flexible, even though it's only putting in legal terms what they've already agreed in principle, which is that the backstop is temporary, they cannot be sure that we would not end up with no deal.
Do MPs have the power to stop a no-deal Brexit? Stephen Bush is political editor at The New Statesman. He joins me now. Stephen, is Jeremy Hunt correct that MPs in Parliament can't actually stop a no-deal Brexit from happening, even if a majority wanted to?
Yeah, he's technically correct in that it's not enough for Parliament to vote, we don't want no deal, which it's already done on several occasions. It has to, under the Article 50 process, on the 29th of March, midnight Brussels time, we leave the European Union with a deal or without one. So MPs not only have to proactively vote against what they don't want, they have to vote for something they want. At the moment, the problem is Parliament is basically as if I went into a restaurant and went, I have no plans to not eat. And you said, well, you can have the fish or the vegetable. And I went, well, I don't want the fish and I don't want the vegetable, but I have no plan to not eat. And that's what MPs are doing at the moment.
Fussy eaters. But what about this idea that some have floated of a so-called managed no deal?
So managed no deal, the idea is that you accept that you're not going to reach an accord with the EU, but you do a deal so that planes fly, that you still have vital medicines coming into the country. I think that's a non-starter for the essential reason that from a political perspective, imagine that you are the head of government in Ireland or France and you have to go to your own electorate and say, well, yes, our own businesses can't trade here. Yes, I've had to put a border on the island of Ireland, but we've given them a deal to prevent them having any chaotic consequences. No one would be able to say that in their own domestic electorates, which is why it just can't happen.
The Times reports today that the Scottish Secretary, David Mundell, has become the first cabinet minister to call for Britain to delay leaving beyond March the 29th. Do you think that's something that, in the end, is quite likely to happen?
Yeah, I think it's very hard to see how we will be able to leave on the 29th of March, because as well as passing this meaningful vote on the withdrawal agreement, she has to pass the withdrawal agreement into law, which means it has to go through first reading, second reading, all of the stages that passing a bill into law goes through. Considering how divided Parliament is, it's very hard to see how all of that will happen between the 21st of January and the 29th of March. So there will have to be at least an extension of Article 50.
And you talk about divisions in Parliament. The Cabinet seems to be increasingly dividing into separate factions. Is there a clear direction of travel as to what people in the Cabinet want?
Yeah, I think there is a clear direction of travel. There's the people talking about managed no deal, which, yeah, I think you can kind of ignore. That is largely domestic posturing for people who'd like to be successful candidates for the Conservative leadership election. The really interesting shift is between people who were talking about a Norway, so a very soft Brexit, which would solve the Irish border issue by having a whole UK solution, so you wouldn't have to risk creating barriers between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. are starting to move towards a second referendum position, which I think is being mirrored by what's happening in the House as a whole. People who were saying they were for a soft Brexit are now saying, look, actually, maybe we can go for a second referendum and bin the whole thing off.
Briefly, if Parliament hasn't managed to agree on anything by, say, the end of January, with the deadline in March looming, presumably by then the government would have to ask for an extension or revoke Article 50.
Yes, and this is where it gets complex. So extension has to be approved by everyone in the EU. So Downing Street is understandably reluctant to do that because they fear you have to have more concessions on Gibraltar, on fishing, on various other painful issues. Now, revoking is in the gift of the government itself, but it's not clear legally whether or not the Prime Minister can revoke by herself, because the Prime Minister makes and unmakes treaties under our Constitution, not Parliament, or because of the Miller case, which ruled that Article 50 affected rights, which are the purview of Parliament, an Article 50 revocation would have to go through Parliament. And again, this comes back to the problem that Parliament can agree on what it doesn't want, but it can't agree on what it does want.
Stephen Bush of New Statesman, thank you. Tens of thousands of police were deployed across France today for the latest protest by the Yellow Vest movement. However, with an estimated 33,000 or so demonstrating across the country, the protesters' enthusiasm seemed rather dampened today. President Macron has made further concessions earlier this week, including a £13 billion package of tax cuts and welfare benefit increases. Hugh Schofield is our correspondent in Paris. Hugh, have the demonstrations felt noticeably smaller and perhaps less vocal across the country today?
Absolutely. I think this is the third Saturday in a row we've spoken on this subject, and there's no question that today it feels like the bottom's come out of it. Just to give you a figure, in Paris there were only, according to the police, 2,200 protesters. Now, from the start, there's never, in these Saturday protests, which have turned very, very violent, have not drawn that many people, but still, 2,200 on the Champs-Élysées. It was just desultory groups of gilets jaunes, the yellow vests wandering up and down, the occasional whiz-bang as tear gas went off, there's a mini confrontation at a police cordon, but really it was nothing. And we haven't, more significantly perhaps, seen any of the troublemakers coming in at the end of the day and breaking and looting and so on. So no one really senses that this was the sort of fag end of a protest movement.
Is the crisis then over for President Macron? Has he done enough?
I think it's certainly over for now. I don't think this will pick up again before Christmas, and then we'll be into the new year. And I think people, when a movement ends, it's very hard to pick it up again. He did give an awful lot on Monday. He gave away 10 billion euros in extra spending that will go into people's purses from next month. And I think a lot of people in the Gilets jaunes movement, who are basically lower middle class types, can see that is quite a concession. There are people who regard it as not as enough. There are people who also feel that the structural problems, economic problems that underlie the original grievances are still very much there. So they're not going to go away. But I think for now, President Macron has defused this, and I think it's on a classic trajectory, this protest movement. It's dying down. I think he can be satisfied that he's not going to see it up again for a while.
Hugh Schofield in Paris, thank you. The families and colleagues of two journalists from the Reuters news agency, jailed in Myanmar, have called on Aung San Suu Kyi's government to release them immediately. It's a year since the arrest of reporters Walone and Kyaw Soo-oo as they investigated a massacre of Rohingya Muslims by the Burmese army. The reporters were later sentenced to 7 years in prison for breaking the country's Official Secrets Act. The trial was condemned by the UN, the EU and press freedom groups. From Yangon, here's our Myanmar correspondent Nick Beek.
Smiles for the camera. In Myanmar, it's always a special moment to capture when a baby reaches 100 days old. And today, the young star of the show, Teta Angel, is behaving perfectly. For mum, Pani Mon, it's the proudest of days, but one her husband is unable to share. He's behind bars, a few miles away.
This is an auspicious and supposedly happy day for my daughter, so I'm trying to smile. But deep down, I just miss my husband so much. All the time I have been hoping he'll be released, ever since day one, when he was arrested.
Her husband, Walone, and his colleague Kyaw Soo-oo are the Reuters reporters who exposed a massacre and were rewarded with a prison cell. The outrage of local Burmese journalists who blocked the police van taking their colleagues to jail to start their sentence was shared across the world. In an extraordinary moment in court, a police captain had admitted it was all a set-up, but he himself was then jailed and the reporters still convicted. For exactly a year now, the two Reuters journalists have been locked up inside this prison here in Yangon. During that time, there have been calls from around the world for them to be freed. The civilian government here in Myanmar, led by Aung San Suu Kyi, has the power to order their immediate release. But so far, the Nobel Peace Prize winner has refused to do so. The wives of the journalists have begged her to intervene. But despite the international outcry surrounding the case, Aung San Suu Kyi continues to claim the reporters were convicted after a fair trial.
They were not jailed because they were journalists. They were jailed because the court has decided that they had broken the Official Secrets Act. So if we believe in the rule of law, they have every right to appeal the judgment and to point out why the judgment is wrong if they consider it wrong.
The reporters have now lodged an appeal against their conviction. It could be a lengthy process. All the while, Jorso U's wife, Chitsu Win, brings up her daughter alone. Mama Lat carefully manoeuvres a toy police car around the floor of their cramped flat, making her own sound effects. But what her family have experienced at the hands of the state security apparatus is very real.
She says, "Mummy, why doesn't Daddy live with us? Is it because he doesn't love us? It's painful for me to hear that." She used to ask the policeman, "Why do you handcuff my daddy?" Then she'd say, "Look, Daddy, I can release you."
Aung San Suu Kyi has the power, as head of the civilian government in Myanmar, to free your husband and his colleague. What would be your message to her today?
Miss Aung San Suu Kyi, my husband respects you so highly. He sees you like a mother. My husband is innocent. My husband absolutely would never harm his country.
The jailing of these journalists has raised deep concerns for the media, free speech and democracy in Myanmar. It seems this is still a country where speaking the truth comes at a heavy price.
Nick Beake reporting from Myanmar. A week on from the alleged racial abuse of England footballer Raheem Sterling during a Premier League game, talk has turned to whether or not the lack of black voices in the media is one stumbling block to rooting out racism in football. In a piece on the BBC website, one BBC Sports News presenter says players are portrayed differently depending on their colour, and that a lack of black voices in journalism is to blame. Freelance sports writer Natasha Henry told him why having black people in a newsroom matters.
I had an experience, I was working for a mainstream newspaper, and the editors there, because they had someone there that was of colour, because it was someone who had gone through personal experience, who would have a personal opinion on the blackface, they asked me, was it racist? How do you think we should word this headline? Should we accuse him of being a racist? If you don't have anyone there who has that personal experience, how can you create the correct story, the correct headline, and tell it with the correct perspectives?
Darren Lewis has been a football writer for the Daily Mirror for 18 years, and I asked him whether things had improved for black players during his time covering the sport.
There has been a change, but it hasn't necessarily been a change for the better. We haven't seen bananas on pitches and black players abused in terms of monkey chanting and the N-word. But it doesn't say anything about football's ability to clean up the issue. Players are still unhappy, players are still not protected, and we have an industry, a media industry as well as a football industry, that really is in denial about the scale of the problem.
What about the people who run football? Are they aware that this is still a problem?
We're asking questions heading in the wrong direction. It is not just about the people who run football. It is the people who are in the media. It is on me to shout louder. I've been in my job as a black man for 18 years. What I've done is stayed far too acquiescent. I've kind of held back on asking the kind of question I need to ask now. What is the BBC doing? What is ITV doing? What is Sky Sports doing? What is the print media doing? We need to ask difficult questions. I've just watched on the BBC channel a Football Focus piece with 4 people discussing the Raheem Sterling incident. You cut back to the studio and you have 3 white men discussing the implications of what has been said in there. BBC Sport doesn't understand this issue well enough because there are so many people making decisions at the BBC who are not black. So it's not about asking what the FA and the people who run football are doing about this. If we ask those questions, we don't understand the issue with respect.
Hugh Wozencroft, who's a black BBC Sports news presenter, has a piece on the website at the moment talking about exactly that, what he sees as a lack of diversity within BBC Sport. The figures, though, within that suggest that something like 18% of BBC Sports news staff are black and minority ethnic, while the national average for the population is 13%. Is there an issue here of subtle factors, like people hiring people in their own image?
Yes, listen, there is an unconscious bias in the media as a whole. But how many of that number, the black contingent within the BBC, are making decisions about output? If you go to the BBC website, how many of the pieces written are written by people who understand black culture, who are black? How many? It is damning for the BBC, not just for the BBC. Other broadcasters as well need to look at themselves. But at the BBC, how many presenters are black? This is about a systemic culture which perpetuates the racism that we are seeing on the football terraces. And unless we all get our individual houses in order, we are in denial.
How do we change that, though? Do we accept that change is incremental, or does it have to be done at political level, at senior level, whether that's in football or the media?
I think it is time for us to grasp the nettle, as we have done with the representation of women within the game. That has been addressed far, far more quickly, with far more seriousness than the reputation of black people within the game. So I don't think it is that difficult an issue to address, but I don't think we have a chance of solving the representation of black footballers unless we deal with that.
Darren Lewis of the Daily Mirror. We approached BBC Sport on this issue and they told us that Football Focus today started with a 9-minute discussion from an entirely diverse panel on racism in football, and BBC Sport says the issue of diversity is one that's affecting the sport media industry as a whole and that BBC Sport is not exempt. They say there's still much to do, but we're working hard to address diversity within BBC Sport, and we've appointed a diversity lead, and a number of our senior editorial figures are black and minority ethnic. They include the editors of Football Focus, the Olympics and Wimbledon, as well as our newly appointed cricket editor. Deirdre is on her way. That's Deirdre, as in the storm, and she's bringing in snow and freezing rain. Let's hear more from Liz Bentley, CEO of the Royal Meteorological Society and visiting professor at the University of Reading. Liz.
Good afternoon. Yes, we've been keeping an eye on Storm Deirdre all day, as she's brought quite treacherous weather actually across most of the UK. As you mentioned, snow and freezing rain, particularly for northern parts of the UK, northern England and Scotland. But even further south, where the temperatures are a little bit higher, it's been a thoroughly miserable day. Heavy rain, lots of surface water around, and some strong winds as well to boot. So it's been a quite treacherous day and a thoroughly miserable day out there, I think, for most of us.
And tell us, if this isn't a stupid question, what is freezing rain? Is it the same as sleet?
No, it isn't actually, and it's quite uncommon for us to see freezing rain in this country. But what happens is basically as the snow falls out of the sky, it goes through a layer of milder air, so the temperature is above zero, and it starts to melt into rainfall. But that rainfall is actually still below zero, so it's in a liquid form, but it's below zero. And as it touches the ground, and the ground's frozen, it's very cold at the surface, it instantly freezes and it forms this glazed ice. And I've seen some pictures today coming in on social social media of twigs and leaves and branches, as well as the ground and gates and fences and so forth, where you get this glazed ice, quite a thick layer of glazed ice. And it can look quite stunning, but obviously it is treacherous if it's on the pavements and the roads, because it's clear ice, it's black ice, you can't see it, and therefore you head out for a walk or in the car and start to skid around. But it is unusual, as I say, in this country for us to see freezing rain. We saw some earlier this year when we had the beast from the east, but normally it's something you'll see on the continent or in the US itself.
And Ireland's already been seeing a fair bit of disruption from Storm Deirdre.
Yes, that's right. And it was the Met Éireann, the Irish Met Service, that named the storm this time because effectively the strong winds for them. But it's the snow, and it'll be the snow over the next probably few hours across northern England, moving to Scotland. This system will then move out into the North Sea, and we'll see the back of Deirdre. So tomorrow, I think, a better day for all of us.
Liz Bentley, thank you. That's all from us. Studio direction by Jay Coburn. Our PM editor, Sophie Borkham. Producers, Scott Adam, Alex Ritchie and Chris Hemmings. Now at 5:30, stay with us for this week's IPM with Luke Jones.
Hello, welcome along. As you limber up for arguments and maybe fierce board games over the Christmas table, remember that parents are often remarkable people. On IPM this week, the luck of finding new parents halfway around the world and the guilt that followed afterwards. Plus, the lengths one listener went through to keep a deathbed promise to her dad.
I just thought, oh no, I'm going to have to do it.
And Stephen Fry is poised to read our bulletin of your news. We'll start, though, with this listener. She and her sister were adopted as babies.
It was something that we always grew up knowing. I think because obviously mixed race families in those days were somewhat more unusual, and it was quite clear that both our parents were white and we weren't. There was obviously a story behind it.
And what kind of year are we talking about here?
1969.
This baby's going to hospital. Yes. There are 18 of them going to hospital.
Where are they, dear?
They're on the bus, and we've been misdirected because...
Heathrow Airport, 11:30 p.m, and flight BD757 was touching down after a marathon weekend journey to the other side of the world and back again. On board, the infant victims of a war none of them understood. All were exhausted.
Our mother left us at the maternity hospital in Saigon during the Vietnam War. We then got taken to an orphanage that was run by a charity, and then we spent the first year of our lives in the orphanage. Due to various publicity about the plight of the orphans in Vietnam and in Saigon, we were lucky enough to find a new family in this country. But yes, we were left at the hospital.
And do you know why you were left?
No, I mean, I can only assume that under those circumstances, really suddenly finding yourself with two small children was a situation that would have been extremely difficult. And whether or not it was because she couldn't cope or whether she thought we would get a better life if she left us, I don't know. There was no further contact after that.
How curious about it were you?
Looking back, I do sometimes wonder why I wasn't more curious, but I think we just lived in the now, really. We knew we were lucky. We knew we had a new family looking after us who loved us. So we never really sort of spent a long time thinking, oh, I wonder what it would have been like if things had have been different. I think there was always an acceptance, certainly on my part, that probably if we hadn't have been given a new life and a new family, we would have died. So the option was death. So you just get on with it, don't you?
Yeah, well, yes.
Or at the very best, a life which would have been extremely different and much harder.
Well, in that many people didn't survive that scenario that you were in.
No, they didn't. I mean, they certainly wouldn't have had a loving family, an education and a chance to make the best of their lives. You know, survival would have been the most you could have hoped for.
And if you've got a handle on it intellectually, how were you with it when you were growing up emotionally?
I did used to wonder a lot about where she was and whether she was okay. I never really thought of her, though, as mum, because my mum was the woman that loved us, who brought us up and gave us so much. So it was more a curiosity maybe about how she felt and why she did it. I mean, I've always assumed rightly or wrongly, that it came from love and wanting us to have a better life. So I think I've always been curious more about why rather than what she is actually like. And I think because for me, I did have another relative as well, a blood relative. It was perhaps slightly different because there was still one other person.
You had a sibling?
Yeah, a sibling who was there as well and had lived through the same situation. So I think perhaps if you didn't have that, you might feel slightly differently.
And was that good to have, because many people in that circumstance go through it alone, adoption, and you had someone who went through exactly the same circumstances as you. So could you air these questions and struggles with them?
I suppose I could have done, but we never really did. And because we had other siblings as well who were our parents' natural children, and our parents never ever treated us any differently to their natural born children. So I think if we'd have chosen to, we could have talked about it, and there's always that opportunity to do so, but it's not something we've really spoken about.
Do you think that's strange that you haven't spoken about it?
No, because we're both quite self-contained, actually. In that respect, it's not something we've ever really spoken about.
You emailed us after we heard from another listener a few weeks back now who was talking about the son who she adopted, who's in his teens and is struggling with questions about who he is, the fact that he's adopted. What did you make of hearing her talking about that?
When she was saying about her son and the feelings of abandonment and the feeling of loss, and although it had been a significant amount of time that he'd been with his new family, I did recognise that. I think because you don't know why, you just sort of think, well, if your own birth mother, the person that gave birth to you, didn't love you enough to keep you, why would anybody else love you that much that they want you? So I could see where his emotion has come from and why it is still there so long afterwards, and certainly during adolescence, because, everybody has feelings that are difficult to deal with in adolescence, and it's something that you can't really control. So I think maybe it's only when you get a bit older that you can sort of start to deal with it. And I say a bit older, it's a lot older in some cases. It's certainly been a lot older in mine. But I think for large chunks of your life, that feeling may go away and then something will happen and it'll come back again for some totally irrational reason. So,
like what kind of instance?
I don't know. Sometimes you just sort of think, oh. I mean, birthdays I used to find very difficult.
Why?
Because it's the one day of the year you'd think, oh, perhaps she's thinking, what did I do? Did I make the right decision? Because all the rest of the time you plod on, don't you? Mm. But I think birthdays it's the one time when, in other families, oh, the day I certainly do it with my own children. Oh, you were born at whatever time, and we went to the hospital at whatever and things. Whereas when you're adopted, it's sort of you don't have that. So no, birthdays I did used to find difficult.
In the interview we had a few weeks ago with the mother talking about her adopted son, she talked about the unconscious trauma whereby he was still years later affected by things which he would have had no memory of because he was very, very young when it happened to him, but still affected him on some level. I guess you were in a similar situation, different kind of very early trauma, but as a baby, you must have suffered trauma.
Yes, and I think, one of the things I remember now, and I think it's very unusual, but didn't occur to me at the time it was unusual, is, when children have bad dreams, mine were always dismembered bodies lying in the middle of the road and bits of body and things like that, and we hated the sound of aeroplanes. And it never occurred to me when, you wake up screaming from things like that this is highly unusual. And now I sort of think, oh gosh, if I had a child and they were saying, I woke up dreaming that there were bits of bodies and rotting skulls and stuff all over the place, I'd be like, whoa, that's not normal. But to me, it was normal.
And of course, mixed into all of this, something that you mentioned in the email that you sent us was an element of survivor's guilt, is how you termed it.
Yes, I've always known, how lucky I am and how different it could have been, and the fact that for a lot of people there was a very different ending. I mean, some people came over and were adopted in families, and adoption can break down, and sometimes it comes very close to breaking down. Others came over and actually they were so ill that when they didn't actually survive, they died when they got over here. And then I think there was a plane that was coming over to bring children to this country, and it crashed and they died. So, you know, it was very much, in some ways, still an element of luck as to how it all turned out in the end. So I think I've always known and been fully aware of how lucky I am. And the fact that my family watched a programme, an appeal was put out, can you help? And, you know, in those days, sending a cheque is probably what most people who wanted to help would have done. But they didn't. They thought about it, prayed about it. They were a Christian family. And in the end came to the conclusion that actually they could offer a home to a child.
And why feel guilty about that? You know, you feel lucky.
Yes.
Why feel guilty?
I suppose because I knew how lucky I was, and you always know that there's people far, far worse off than you. So I don't know, it's not rational, is it, to feel guilty? Maybe it's just about sort of, you've been given a chance at life, so now try and make a difference. You know, you can't be brilliant, you can't be fantastic, but, you know, I've always been a believer in the little things count. And because I'm so lucky, just try and make small differences to other people. And if that's a smile or a good morning or whatever, just do it.
How Vietnamese are you, would you say?
Probably not at all, actually, because growing up in a white family, there wasn't really any element of, oh, this is where you came from, these would have been your traditions. The ethos at the time was very much, this is what you've got now, and it wasn't really sort of connecting with your past. You know, this is your future, this is your current, and this is what it is. It's strange, really, because I've got 2 children and they are mixed heritage, and it wasn't really till they went to university and they sort of came across a much more diverse range of people. They actually sort of embraced their mixed heritage a lot more. So no, I think because...
What did you make of that? What was that like to see?
Oh, that was really nice, actually. Yeah, it was good.
Have you ever been to Vietnam?
No.
As in since?
No. I think at one point I wouldn't have wanted to. And then when you get to the stage where you think, oh, perhaps I wouldn't mind, you've reached the stage where you can't afford it anymore. No, at one point I had no desire at all. And I think I didn't really want to know, hand on heart, you know, I didn't really want to open that can of worms. But now I'm perhaps a bit more curious, but no burning desire to know a history or anything like that. But if someone said, oh, would you like to go back? I've got the money and we can go. I wouldn't necessarily say no, you know, just to go and have a quick look.
Our listener, ipm@bbc.co.uk is how to reach us. If you are busy, I mean, we've all got lives to lead, you can just send us one sentence, if you like. It could be about anything you like. Life-changing, trivial, they're all welcome in our Your News Bulletin. Reading it this week, everybody's favourite Stephen Fry. It's Stephen Fry.
Yesterday, I caught a bus, only to find that my wife was the driver. I've just finished my initial 8 weeks of community rehab for alcoholism, my life saved by a charity. I am a 55-year-old hospital doctor. On rediscovering my Labrador's papers, I find that he is 11, not 7. The ban on sleeping on the sofa is duly lifted. 30 years after making a complete hash of my marketing diploma, I passed my mini MBA with a distinction. Perhaps I can finally put 3 decades of imposter syndrome behind me. I've got advanced breast cancer, and now brandy is my favourite drink. My husband set off yesterday from the UK to bring clothes parcels back to us here in Transylvania. very proud of my PhD student passing his Viva this week. He pulled it all together despite a year out to deal with lymphoma. I just happily went into my lovely local library to be confronted with a computer on the librarian's desk that is taking her job. I came out very sad. I am widowed and have come to the realization that I am still in love with my boyfriend of 50 years ago, who recently tracked me down to tell me that he had never forgotten me. I paid my last ever toll on the Severn Bridge, having travelled across the bridge since the 60s. Today, I played a Beyoncé song to the woman who ordained me into a Buddhist order. I recently became a voluntary trustee of a children's bereavement charity and have since discovered that the main cause of my mental health problems stem from traumas after my dad died from the effects of his World War II service. I donated a lot of good books to help raise funds for the church, but they were taken off the bookstall because I'd donated them.
Stephen Fry, next week, Sue Lawley will be reading your news, IPM at bbc.co.uk, for a sentence about what's happening in your life. Now, it was about a year ago that we started hearing about promises that listeners had made to departing loved ones. You might remember that Sheila is still yet to scatter her stepmother's ashes, but one listener told us about scattering a relative's ashes over the doorway at Harrods, of all places, so that they'd stick to tourists' shoes and then travel all over the world. One listener agreed to lie about the deceased's age on the tombstone, a wife agreed to finish her husband's novel, and a granddaughter ended up shot in the bum and kidnapped in Mogadishu, all because of deathbed promises. They are the best stories, and this one from Fiona may be the best. Dr. Fiona Beddoes-Jones, when did you first find out that your dad was a naturist?
Oh, well, I've always known. My mother thought it was a bit peculiar and actually left him when we were 6 months old.
When did he do it?
Well, he didn't really like clothes, so he would be naked at home for most of the time.
Did he do it out of the house?
He would do it out of the house at the naturist club that he was a member of at the time. I mean, he wouldn't do it in public. You know, naturist clubs are private members clubs.
And so what would they do at these clubs? They would just sort of all hang around naked?
No, it doesn't work like that. It's a club where people share beliefs and values. They like the feeling of the sun and, you know, the warm wind on their skin. They don't like to be encumbered by clothes. And everybody is beautiful. You know, whether you're tall, short, fat, thin, scarred, able-bodied, less able-bodied, you know, everybody, and I mean everybody in one word and everybody with 2 words.
You sound sold on it.
Well, I'll come to that bit later, shall I?
Well, right you are. So the reason you got in touch with us was because we were talking again about deathbed promises.
Yes, indeed.
Because we did a programme, I think it was over a year ago now, where listeners got in touch with the kind of things that they'd got themselves into by promising someone something.
Yeah.
What was the deathbed promise you made?
Well, the deathbed promise that I made was to my father. I hadn't grown up with him, so whilst I knew him well, it wasn't the father-daughter, you know, relationship where you've lived with someone, where you know them inside out. There'd always been, you know, a little bit of a distance between us because we hadn't really seen each other very much. And when I went to the hospital and saw him, and I knew it was going to be the last time because he really, really, really wasn't well, he asked me if I would do a memorial service, and he asked me if I'd do it at the club where he'd been a member for more than 50 years, and these people had become not just his friends but, you know, almost like family to him, and he'd spent a lot of time at the club. And I think he said something like, "You will do it naked, won't you, dear?" That's the kind of thing he would have said. I can hear him saying it now. "You will do it naked, won't you, dear?" And I said, "Yes, Dad, I promise I'll do it naked." And that's why I cried all the way home. You know,
why were you crying?
Well, I was crying because, he was my father, and although we'd had a bit of a distant relationship, he was my father and I did love him, of course. And because who really wants to stand up naked in front of a group of other people who are also naked? You wouldn't. It's one of...
Well, your father, for one.
Well, public speaking is one of the biggest fears that people have, isn't it?
Yeah.
And when we have a nightmare, we often imagine ourselves naked on a stage or something. It's a huge fear. It's not a normal thing to do, let's face it. And the advice that people give you? Imagine the audience naked. It doesn't work. It really doesn't work.
But when you're at your father's side and he wanted you to do this memorial service and said, will you do it naked? And you said, of course. What did you think when you heard those words coming out of your mouth?
I just thought, oh no, I'm going to have to do it.
I mean, you serious?
I couldn't. Yeah, I wouldn't promise to do something and then not do it. That doesn't seem right to me.
So how did you prepare? Did you take advice? Did you scout out the place?
Take advice? No, I didn't take any advice. Interestingly, we'd already had the funeral. A lot of his friends from the club came, so I'd already met them. So I'd met
clothed.
I'd met them clothed at the funeral, and they were all very nice. And I got there in the morning and we scattered the ashes, and then 3:00 was the time that we'd agreed to do the service, because on a Sunday afternoon there was always afternoon tea. The ladies would bake cakes and make sandwiches, and it was really lovely. I remember being naked, and I'd taken with me a letter that my father had written to his best friend, who'd also been a member of the club, who died a year before. And my father had written a letter to his friend after his friend's death to say how much he missed him and how much he was looking forward to seeing him in heaven. And I was more nervous about reading the letter and making a mess of it and getting overwhelmed and crying and breaking down. I was more nervous about reading the letter than I was actually about standing there naked in front of everybody. So because I was concentrating so hard on reading the letter, I almost didn't realise I had no clothes on. I almost forgot. Not quite, but almost.
Yeah. And when you were stood there, was there a point where you looked up from the letter and saw the assembled nudes in front of you?
Oh, many points. Many points. Yes. And that's really difficult until you get used to it. And
how long does it take to get used to it?
I'd been there all day, remember. It probably takes about half an hour to get used to it.
And I bet it's interesting.
Well, it is interesting. It's fascinating because you kind of stop looking at the bodies and just become attuned to the person. I went to London the next day and it was very, very strange seeing people with clothes on. It was really odd.
Did it feel like an achievement?
Felt like a relief. It only felt like an achievement in the sense that I'd fulfilled the promise that I'd made to my dad. That was the achievement. And I think I would have felt that whatever I'd promised to do. It was also about being respectful to the club members' beliefs and values. That was the other thing. It was...
And your dad's beliefs and values.
Well, yes, as well. Yeah, and I think there's something very important about that.
Do you think he would have been proud?
I'm sure he would have been proud. I just felt that it was the right thing to do, and I'm so pleased that I did it.
Thank you so much for your time, Fiona. I really appreciate it. Was that all right?
Oh, fabulous. Actually...
Oh, go on. What were you going to say?
I actually now spend quite a lot of time naked in my own garden, if it's warm enough. I really like it. To feel a warm breeze on your skin and not be constricted by clothes is really, really lovely. At least I really like it. The farmer opposite complained. He said he didn't think it was appropriate for the church warden to be naked.
Are you the church warden?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, good. I didn't think there were two of you or something. No.
Yes, I am the church warden.
What did you say to him?
I told him not to look. He's got a very big tractor. You know how these tractors are so much higher than cars. He's the only person who can see. So I keep an eye out for the tractor, and if I do see one, I dive into the garden and to spare anybody's blushes.
Fiona, bearing all. That was a promise she made to someone on their deathbed, to her dad, in fact. If you have a similar story, a deathbed promise story, please share it. We absolutely love them. IPM@bbc.co.uk.
That was Luke Jones with this week's IPM. The producer was Kat Farnsworth. Now, at 6 minutes to 6, it's time for the shipping forecast issued by the Met Office on behalf of the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency at 1725 on Saturday the 15th of December. There are warnings of gales in all areas except Biscay, Trafalgar and Bailey. The general synopsis at midday: low northwest Ireland 984, expected Faroes 983 by midday tomorrow. Low Shannon 982, losing its identity. The area forecast for the next 24 hours: Viking, North Utsira, South Utsira. Southeasterly gale 8 to storm 10, perhaps violent storm 11 later in Viking. Wintry showers, then rain or sleet, good, occasionally poor. Forties, Cromarty, Fourth Tyne, Dogger. Southeast gale 8 to storm 10, veering south or southwest 6 to gale 8, occasionally 5 later. Showers, then rain or sleet, good, occasionally poor. Fisher, German Bight. Southeast gale 8 to severe gale 9, decreasing 5 to 7 later. Occasional sleet or snow, moderate or good, occasionally very poor. Humber, Thames. Southeast 7 to severe gale 9, veering southwest 4 or 5. Rain, then showers, good, occasionally poor. Dover, White, Portland, Plymouth. West or southwest 5 to 7, occasionally gale 8 at first. Rain, then squally showers, good, occasionally poor. Biscay, west or southwest 5 to 7, perhaps gale 8 later. Rain, then squally showers, good, occasionally poor. Fitzroy, Seoul, westerly or southwesterly 6 to gale 8, occasionally 5 in South Fitzroy. Squally showers, good, occasionally poor. Lundy, Fastnet, Irish Sea. Cyclonic gale 8 to storm 10, becoming west or southwest 5 to 7. Rain or squally showers, good, occasionally poor. Shannon, west or southwest 5 to 7, occasionally gale 8 at first. Squally showers, good, occasionally poor. Rockall, Malin, Hebrides. Cyclonic 6 to gale 8, occasionally severe gale 9 at first, becoming southwest 5 to 7. Rain or squally showers, good, occasionally poor. Bailey, cyclonic, becoming south 5 to 7, becoming variable 4 at times. Rain or showers, moderate or good. Fair Isle, southeast gale 8 to storm 10, veering southwest 6 to gale 8 later. Rain or showers, moderate or poor. Faroes and southeast Iceland, cyclonic, southeasterly becoming cyclonic 6 to gale 8, occasionally severe gale 9 in Faroes, decreasing 4 or 5 except in northeast. Rain or showers, good, occasionally poor. And that completes the shipping forecast. Now with a more general forecast for you, here's Darren Bett.
Thanks very much indeed, Diana. It's been a grim winter's day today. Storm Deirdre continuing to bring a mixture of strong winds, rain, snow and some freezing rain too. We still have amber Met Office warnings into the night. Snow, first of all, for Scotland. I think most of it is going to be to the north of the central belt, where there could be as much as 20 centimetres of snow by the morning. There may be some snow over the higher ground, in particular across southern parts of Scotland. But we've got ice warnings again, amber ice warnings from the Met Office for central southern Scotland and northern England, where freezing rain continues to bring some treacherous conditions. Quite unusual to get freezing rain. It is very dangerous. But we should slowly start to see a transition to rain and snow mix over the next few hours. And the band of wet weather sweeps away from most areas by midnight. Very windy weather for a while across western parts of Wales and northwest England. But things calm down by the time we get to the morning. And tomorrow should be a much milder day. Tomorrow, across Northern Ireland and Scotland, there's still going to be a mixture of sunny spells and scattered showers, and in Scotland in particular, there'll still be wintry in the morning, and it still could be quite icy, but conditions should tend to improve. Most places will be dry in the afternoon. Temperatures only up to around 6 or 7 degrees, but that's an improvement certainly on what we've seen today. Across northwest England, Wales and southwest England tomorrow, there'll be some sunny spells in the morning, showers or longer spells of rain developing during the afternoon. The rain could be quite heavy for a while, temperatures of 8 to 10 degrees. The Midlands, northeast England, eastern England and southeast England, sunny tomorrow morning, more cloud in the afternoon, but probably dry until we get the showers in the evening, and temperatures are milder, 7 to 9 Celsius.
Thanks, Darren.
My castaway this week is the economist Professor Mariana Mazzucato.